Hello and welcome to this second lecture of 10th week. So, today we are going to discuss about adaptation finance. So, in the last lecture, that means first lecture of 10th week or the 46th lecture, we discussed about in general the climate finance, and in today's lecture, that is the 47th lecture, we are going to emphasize more as far as the adaptation finance is concerned. So, let us discuss about the major concepts or the key subsections we are going to cover. One is the definition. First, we will try to understand the definition of adaptation finance. So, we will establish the concept and purpose of adaptation finance. We will also try to understand how the assessment as far as the global flow is concerned. So, analyzes the current adaptation finance flows and trends, highlight finance gaps, that means compare actual flow with estimated needs, identification of sources and instruments, that will outline providers and delivery methods as far as finance is concerned. I will also analyze barriers and challenges, that means discussing the reasons for inefficient funding, and finally, we will summarize international policy developments. So, moving on as far as the introduction to adaptation finance is concerned, the definition. Adaptation finance refers to funding aimed at, so the fund which is aimed at or targeted for reducing climate vulnerability and enhancing resilience to climate impacts in societies, economies and ecosystems. So, once again it refers to funding that is aimed at or targeted for reduction in terms of vulnerability and enhancing the resilience to climate impacts as far as society, economy and ecosystem is concerned. Then it encompasses financing at all levels, including local, national and also transnational levels, drawn from various sources such as public, private and alternative sources. This adaptation finance, it pays for things like strengthening housing and infrastructure to withstand from extreme weather events, developing drought tolerant crops, creating social safety nets such as cash, food or insurance to help with recovery from climate related disasters or improving access to climate information for better management and climate related risks. Moving on to adaptation finance, it helps in terms of building resilience to climate impacts. Funding aimed at reducing vulnerability and enhancing resilience to climate impacts in societies, economies and ecosystem, as mentioned, primarily targets for the developing countries and address greatest climate risk with least resources. So, what funding pays for? So, the funding that is under this scheme or this context of adaptation finance, it pays for stronger infrastructure as far as resilient housing, seawalls and drainage are concerned, social safety nets such as disaster insurance or resistant crops, irrigation, all those things, and also in terms of various information that helps in planning this, such as early warning systems, EWS, and coming out with climate related information or climate data generation. So, towards this the climate finance can be invested or can be funded. Moving to financial instruments as far as the adaptation is concerned. As far as the financial instruments is concerned, it requires a diverse range of instruments to address the adaptation investment where high debt levels limit the ability of vulnerable nations to invest in resilience. The mitigation finance is often market driven. Adaptation depends heavily on public and concessional sources. The grants, that means non-repayable funds provided by governments or international climate funds to support adaptation projects such as early warning systems, climate resilient agriculture and coastal protection. Concessional loans, loans offered at below market interest rates or with long repayment periods to finance climate resilient infrastructure and adaptation programs in developing countries. What is the insurance mechanism? So, insurance mechanism talks about the financial tools such as climate risk insurance and catastrophe insurance that protect communities, farmers and government from losses caused by extreme weather events. Climate bonds and resilience bonds, debt instruments used to raise capital for projects that enhance climate resilience, including flood control systems, drought resilient water infrastructure and resilient urban planning. And finally, a kind of blending finance, as we already discussed in the last class, a financing approach that combines public or concessional funds with private investments to reduce risks and attract private capital into adaptation projects. So, why adaptation finance is critical? Why we need? What is its importance? So, climate change impacts such as floods, droughts and storms are intensifying day by day, especially in vulnerable countries. So, what do we mean by this? As we are experiencing more and more in terms of temperature rise and other impacts as far as the climate change is concerned, it is more so realized in terms of extreme weather events such as floods, drought, storms and other intensification or frequency or higher frequency. So, adaptation actions include strengthening infrastructure, improving agricultural practices and preparing communities for future risks. The need for adaptation finance is driven by disproportionate risks and lack of resources in developing countries. So, mitigation finance accounted for 94% of global climate spending in 2023. So, which amounted in totality 1.78 trillion US dollars. So, by 2023, this mitigation finance accounted for 94%, 94% of this, that is 1.78 trillion. Adaptation finance, however, remains low low, that means up to 68 billion, that which makes about 6% of the total. So, 65 billion in 2023, the far below 222 billion needed annually for emerging and developing economies by 2023. So, look at this point, very important. The mitigation finance accounted for 94% of global climate spending in 2023, which amounts for 1.73 trillion US dollar. In comparison, this adaptation finance was very low, that means to the tune of $65 billion, which in 2023, but we need 222 billion, which is required by in terms of supporting the developing economy or developing countries by end of this decade. So, as we see from the left hand side depiction, the figure what is given here, it talks about the relationship among the climate risks, adaptation actions and financial flows. So, what are the climate risk and impacts? We know in terms of physical risk, in terms of economic risk, in terms of the social risk. So, this drives the need for reduction as far as all these things are concerned. So, we need climate adaptation actions. So, for that, down below you can see the other box that talks about the finance flow mechanisms. In terms of the climate adaptation action, we need it for infrastructure ecosystem development and coastal protection. Infrastructure ecosystem such as green infrastructure, data for modeling, climate related modeling. We need it for developing early warning system. We also need it for disaster preparedness and also towards public health system. We need it for agriculture and livelihood such as drought resistant crop and also the diversification of the crop rotation, crop diversification we have already discussed. Social health as far as the disaster and public health is concerned. So, climate adaptation action are needed for in these areas. Now, it requires investment. It requires investment. It generates also financial flows. So, let us see what are the financial flow mechanisms available in terms of public, private and innovative finance. As far as the public finance is concerned, GCF, MDBs, green bonds, national budgets, they all are available. The private finance impact particularly banks and climate funds, and the innovative funds such as blended finance, guarantees, debt for climate swaps. So, all this actually make the or compose means links the climate risk, adaptation action and the financial flows. So, the key idea is strategic investment in adaptation will lead to reduction in terms of future economy, social losses, creating long term resilience against climate related climate change related related impacts, related disaster, related other issues. The key funders and financial instruments in adaptation. So, the overview of financial actors and adaptation in terms of finance data, adaptation finance data availability is this. You can see on the left hand side we have public, and the upper one is public and the lower one is the private. Left hand side we are talking about international and the right hand side we are talking about the domestic situation. As far as the public, international, we have multilateral, bilateral, regional development financial institutions. We also have the foreign government agencies, officials and development assistance. We also have multilateral climate funds. As far as the right hand side is concerned, we have ministries of finance, national development banks, national climate funds and the state owned enterprise. Down below we have the private, and as far as the international sector is concerned, we have the institutional investors, for example, sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. Insurance companies and private equity and venture capital, they all fall under this private international categories. As far as the domestic private categories, we have commercial banks, they support corporates and also small and medium sized enterprises. So, relative data availability in terms high, medium, low. As far as you see the color gradation talks about the data availability in terms of high, medium and low. So, the sources of adaptation finance, multilateral development banks, MDBs, bilateral agencies, UN funds, they all are for example adaptation and the green climate funds. So, instruments such as grants, concessional loans, blended finance mechanism, green and resilience bonds, insurance solutions. Public finance, the dominant source with multilateral banks, development agencies and government budgets providing most of the funds as far as different countries or nations are concerned. For example, Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, Least Developed Countries Fund, etc. Moving on to the global trends during 2021 to 24, look at this as far as the three histograms are concerned. Global adaptation finance USD up to, you can see, for 49 billion USD, and 2021 to 2022 it is 63 billion. So, 28% increase, and whereas the public finance percentage 78%. So, you can see private and public in terms of 3% increase there. So, adaptation finance grew by 28% year on year, reaching USD 63 billion in 2021 to 2022 compared to 49 billion in the previous year, that is 2019 to 2020. So, while adaptation finance is growing, the pace and scale remain insufficient to address global needs, particularly private sector. So, we need to do more. It is increasing, but the speed and the magnitude has to be really more. So, that is what is required, and also the source from the private sources should be more. The public actors, as we know, remain the dominant force, providing 78% of international adaptation finance to emerging markets, whereas the private sector contribution is very minimum, less than 3% globally. So, there we have to work on primarily through grants and other philanthropic donations or investments. So, regional breakdown, as far as this is concerned, you see East Asia Pacific 45% of all flow, mostly domestic, led by China. Africa just 20%, Latin America and Caribbean, and South Asia they are just all 10% each. So, very less coming from this sector wise or this particular country wise figure is concerned. So, next is the overview of sectoral trends in adaptation finance. Look at this, the adaptation finance needs also differ from income level. So, look at the other way of dissecting this. The adaptation finance also this needs also differ by income level. The low income, high income category, they have a different level of requirement as far as the adaptation finance is concerned. The low income countries tend to focus heavily on sectors like agriculture, food along with energy and transport, whereas the lower middle income countries they prioritize their other sectors such as infrastructure, water supply, including agriculture, food with health, sanitation also including health and sanitation. But as we move up to the upper or middle income countries or middle income groups, the agriculture remains dominant, but forestry, ecosystem biodiversity, so other service sectors, water supply, they all receive significant attention. So, what does it mean? This means that there is indication that adaptation priorities evolve as countries develop information for adaptation finance. So, the estimated annual adaptation finance needs for developing countries vary substantially across various regions. On the right hand side, we have put the sectoral distribution of adaptation finance need by region. We can see from for different sectors in terms of East Asia Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and Caribbean, and as far as the breakup is concerned for different sectors like water, transport, tourism, infrastructure, industry, health, energy, disaster, cross-cutting and coastal and also agricultural food. So, this particular cumulative histogram, they talk about very disproportionate requirement or sectoral trend as far as various countries or nations are concerned. So, this is also dependent in terms of various income category or income level, as we just discussed with respect to low, middle and upper middle kind of income groups. So, they will have different requirement as far as the adaptation is concerned, and thereby also they will have different requirements as far as the adaptation finance is concerned. Moving on to the adaptation finance gap in terms of estimates and the trends. The adaptation finance gap is defined as the difference between the estimated cost of meeting a given adaptation target and the amount of finance available for adaptation. the global adaptation funding is widening. The adaptation finance needs for developing countries are estimated up to 212 billion per year by 2030. So, just before we also had a figure of 222. So, this is little bit variation, but it is 200 plus range kind of a figure. So, 200 plus billion US dollar is a kind of per year requirement as far as the adaptation implementation is concerned in the developing countries. So, current annual adaptation finance flows to developing countries are only very less, we discussed, and the gap between adaptation finance flows and need is widening due to increasing cost of adaptation, relatively slow growth in adaptation flows globally. So, this gap is increasing. So, we need to work on this. Estimated adaptation finance flows and need in developing countries in terms of 21 to 2035. So, globally tracked adaptation finance still represents only a small portion of the total climate finance. So, adaptation finance is a small portion, is a very small portion of the total finance. So, that is even that is also uneven and has developed heterogeneously across regions and sectors. Look at this adaptation type and ease of financing. On the upper part of this diagram, we have put the adaptation consideration in blue or and we have put in blue or a kind of brown kind of color fill, and in the middle portion we have mentioned the potential for financing, and the down part or the bottom part the financing consideration have been shown. And as you see, the increase or the gradation of the color talks about easier to difficult kind of situation. So, on the upper part, in terms of adaptation consideration, there is timing of action, nature of adaptation, intent of action, and type of option. As far as the lower part is concerned, the financing consideration in terms of types of investment, adaptation investment, that is delivering adaptation in terms of capital delivery, capacity expenditure, staff maintenance, social expenditure in terms of recurring expenditure. The target groups, that is higher income countries and individuals, financial variability as far as repayment is concerned, and the most vulnerable, that is high risk, low access to finance and currently in high risk condition. The next one is project size and actors. So, there investment size is large, it is easy, and small and fragmented. So, in terms of large investment size, it is large single projects in terms of infrastructure and such kind of projects, whereas small, that means large number of individual actors aggregated in terms of actions. In terms of revenue streams, as you see, the market sector, financial benefits and revenue streams such as agriculture, non-market sector, public goods, economic benefits, for example ecosystem services. So, this is the adaptation type and ease of financing. So, as far as the adaptation finance needs and flow is concerned, we can see the comparison of adaptation financing needs, the model cost and international public adaptation finance flows in developing countries. So, the developing nations will need up to 310 to 365 US dollar means billion US dollar per year in terms of adaptation. So, by 2035. So, we had a figure of 210 to 220 in billion USD for the developing countries by 2030. By 2035, it will still be higher to the tune of 310 to 365, different estimates coming from different sources. So, meeting the climate challenge will require a scaling up of adaptation finance. but also a more strategic approach to investment, shifting from reactive based adaptation solution towards more challenging anticipatory based solutions. On the left hand side, friends, you see the in terms of the finance needs, first one, it is shown, the graph shows US the in terms of USD, in terms of billion of USD requirement for developing countries to the tune of 350, and then model cost for adaptation by 2035, and then the finance flows, adaptation finance gap using the finance needs as a reference. So, this is very clear that the developing countries need lot of money to attend to this kind of adaptation requirement as far as climate change is concerned. So, this flow of finance in terms of adaptation finance is required, and the requirement is to the tune of 300 USD per year. The major barriers to scaling the adaptation finance, you see, there are lack of bankable adaptation projects, weak enabling environment, and insufficient projection in national budgets. Gap in tracking and measuring adaptation benefits hinder effective allocation and scaling efforts. Private sector involvement remains limited by uncertainty about returns and inadequate risk sharing. Non-revenue generating most adaptation projects, particularly resilient roads, water management, they do not generate the predictable cash flows required by private investors. Small scale, high transaction cost, adoption is highly localized, and project sizes are often small. That makes deal, so leading to making deal in terms of original expensive origination of expensive, that means high transaction cost. So, these are the major barriers to scale of the adaptation finance. You can see in terms of the prism diagram. So, down below you have the social and equity barriers. Next you have policy and regulation barriers. Next you have technical data barriers at institutional and governance barriers, and also the financial barriers. So, these together make or gives us an overview in terms of the barriers as far as different categories of hurdles in mobilizing the adaptation finance is concerned. So, the global policy development, in terms of global policy development in climate adaptation 2021 to 24. So, we move from, look at the graph on the left hand side. In 2015, the Paris Agreement established for the first time a process to agree on a global goal on adaptation. And 2021 in COP26, when we moved on to Glasgow, we talked about the 1.5 and 2 degree challenge in terms of the net zero emission target. So, there in the Glasgow Climate Pact urged climate countries to double adaptation finance flows. So, from 2019 level to 2025, roughly up to 40 billion. So, it was double there. In COP28, moving ahead from 26 to 28, that will focus on the global goal on adaptation, that is GGA, the establishment of new collective quantified goal NCQG, both of which highlight the urgency for higher ambition on climate finance, especially for adaptation. Moving on to our national level. So, national adaptation plans are now exist in 171 countries, but implementation still lags behind the commitment. So, that means we need to work on more in that sector as far as individual nation is concerned. The need for transformational adaptation, large scale systematic change instead of incremental improvement is being stressed in the latest reports. Look at the diagram on the left hand side that talks about the global policy development in climate adaptation during 2021 to 24. So, on the moving towards increased focus as far as the adaptation finance and resilience, we have three, as we just mentioned: 21 Glasgow, 23 UAE, framework for global climate resilience COP28, and global trend in terms of National Adaptation Fund snaps and the transformation. So, this is what in terms of the global policy development as far as the climate adaptation is concerned. So, to make this we have taken help of this literature. The PPT slides were made using this literature. All the depictions and the figures have been taken from these sources. So, moving on to the conclusion, there is a widening financial gap. While adaptation finance flows have grown from 63 billion, they remain still drastically below the estimated 212 billion to 365 billion. So, different estimates of the range of 212 to 365 billion US dollar range at an annual scale for developing countries. That has to be realized during the period of or by 2030 to 2035. So, if it is 2030, so 212 or 222 and 35 correspond to 365 billion USD. The second point we discussed is the public dominance versus the private absence. The public sector currently provides the vast majority, that means 78% in terms of international adaptation finance, while the private sector contribution is very low. It is merely less than 3%. So, there we need more, we need to work more, particularly contributions from the philanthropic sector. The third is bridging the adaptation gap requires strong policy, innovative financial instruments and greater international cooperation. And the last is the path forward. What is the path forward? The path forward is global policy must push beyond incremental changes, thereby then only it will meet the climate challenge that requires a fundamental shift from short term reactive financing to strategic, anticipatory and transformational adaptation investment. This is what we discussed today with respect to adaptation finance, and the main conclusion point is that we need to work more to realize the benefit of what you say adaptation as far as the climate change is concerned. So, we need a assured fund flow mechanism, and that has been estimated to the tune of 222 to 265 billion USD per annum as far as the developing countries is concerned. So, the private and the philanthropic sector has to come forward to help and promote and generously fund in sector, so as to realize the maximum goal or optimal goal of this adaptation through adaptation finance. Thank you very much.